I've been thinking a lot about the analogies that I hear with regard to barbarians at the gate of Rome. And there's a lot of analogies and metaphors about that, that the barbarians are at the gate, and who are they and where are they coming from? And I've got a I've got a different view. I think about it differently, and I think about the analogy that's closer to my understanding, which is the analogy of imperial Rome and the conquest of Britain. And so that's the direction I want to go. And the most concise example is the example of imperial Rome and the Druids. And the Druids were a fairly well organized society by all reports. And that's the central issue of this analogy is that the reports are non-existent from the Druids. They're only existent from the perspective of the Romans, imperial Rome, and their armies and the reports of their generals and their victories and their assessment of what they did and why they did it. And of course, it's the assessment of the victors who justify all of their behaviors. So it's not the first time. I mean, this goes on through history, and the results are pretty much everywhere. However, what I want to talk about is how did this occur in terms of the orientation of the parties? And what does that have to say to us today? Well, one of the things that I think is important to understand, it was an imperial throne which devastated Britain. I mean, it brought all kinds of industry and pillaged a lot of the minerals and wealth until its collapse in the 400s. And I think that's the best analogy to use. The reality is that our government is an imperial government. It lacks everything but an emperor. And it seeks to further its own concerns. It's seeking to enrich itself and employ its children and formulate ways to expand and influence its power. It is an imperial government. Right now, it just lacks an emperor. And I can foresee someday that emperor will show up, unless there's an intervening force. But I want to look at the history of the Druids a little more closely. I don't agree with their practices necessarily. I'm not a pagan, but it's instructive to understand what happened to them and why it happened to them, because they resisted Rome. And they were, by the accounts available from other ancillary sources, they were quite an intellectual, well-organized community. They were a center of learning in the area of their own expertise. So these were not just casual, nomads, wanderers in the forests. These were well-organized communities. And they wanted us to have a say-so in their development and in their history. And Rome said, no, we don't think so. We want it. We are imperial. We are Rome. We are the greatest warriors on the earth, and we are going to tell you what to do. And of course, they didn't. And so there were repeated invasions into the lands of the Druids, I guess mostly Wales. But the geography is not much of concern. What is of concern, though, is the mentality of Rome. And the mentality of Rome is that we are the imperial power, and we are going to assert ourselves. And if you don't lay down and submit to our rule willingly, we're going to murder you. And that's what they did. And there were a series of invasions which were in fact massacres. as they basically obliterated the Druids. And so the Druids, a few remain, a few bards here and there, and you can kind of get a sense of that from the literature of that part of the world, and the storytelling, and the wonderful tradition of storytelling that comes from that part of the world. But the importance is that Imperial Rome had no trouble massacring those who didn't agree. And they're not the only ones. I mean, there's countless others, you know. Mostly they're communists. But Rome is an interesting case because it so parallels our society, and that we think we have a citizens' government. Rome thought it had a Senate. The Senate was corrupted. Imperial dictates began to appear, and now emperors became gods. How similar is that to our circumstances, where we no longer have civilian-led government? The idea that we have a civilian-led military is absurd. We can see that every day in the news. The military seems to be and seems to think it is a power unto itself, and it's going to do whatever it wants. And it finds bureaucratic allies where it can align itself and exert bureaucratic power. And so we see that in various government agencies as they assert themselves in collaboration with other agencies, and they circumvent very cleanly and clearly civilian authorities. So the elected officials who are in our government virtually have no influence whatsoever. They are not directing government as such. And even when laws are enacted, they are circumvented very cleverly by statutes and the writers of the laws. And it's those writers of the law that are the ones that are really controlling our society. So if you want, you can think of first century Jerusalem and the terror that people lived under, the terror of Rome. And I want to talk a little bit more about that in the context of numbers, because I think people think that there were, some crucifixions here and there, and these tales of the murder of infants are kind of exaggerated. They're not. In one day, 6,000 people were crucified. And some say as many as 100,000 to 1 million people around the world were crucified by Rome. This was a pervasive practice. It was barbaric, and it was terrorizing and traumatizing to all those who came in contact with Rome. And it's why Rome ultimately collapsed. But not until millions died. And it's the path we're on as our government seeks to imperialize itself, where all of a sudden the leaders of the government are above reproach. They are above the law. They don't seem to be accountable. Those that are caught in their acts of what I don't know what to call corruption disappear into the shadows. They are not held accountable for their behaviors. And no matter how hard our investigative reporters try, and they do try very hard, nothing comes of it. There's not. And there's not because there's no will in the government itself to restrain itself. It's seeking to find no limit to its authority and power and influence. And it wants money, and it wants your money, and lots of it, and lots of authority to use it in any way that it wants. So I think that's the analogy that I'd like to kind of lean into a little bit here. The analogy of the massacre of the Druids. Because in the mind of the imperial government, which is our government today, we are the Druids. We are the barbarians. And we are the ones that have the ideas that must be obliterated and erased from history. And indeed, the Druids were erased from history. Nobody knows anything about them. You know, a few post holes in the ground. Most of their stuff is long gone. A few slate shelters, a few communities that were practicing their pagan rites. And all this occurred, you know, before Rome became Christianized. This is 100, 200, 300. And then even in the Christianization of Rome, it didn't stop the murder and massacring of all kinds of people all over the place. There was no attempt to convince or cooperate or sympathize or to show a better way. It was pretty much off with your head. And so that is a warning to us that these imperial powers are unrestrained in their quest for power. And we should take that under advisement. And we should get much more serious about the encroachment on civil society by an imperial bureaucracy. They don't yet have an emperor or an empress, but they well may very soon. It's their goal to have an iron-fisted, localized, centralized power structure from which they can operate with impunity and use all the technology and all the resources of an industrialized society to achieve their ends. So I say to you, and I say to myself, look for other ways to assert yourself. Don't stay within the typical confines of the framing of the narrative of the day. If you allow them to frame the narrative, you're really going to find very little success. We need to frame the narrative, and we need to put it into terms that can be easily understood, because these folks are absolutely corrupt. They are just as corrupt as the Roman Senate. They are just as vicious as Caesar. And they think Caesar was a great guy. And so, you know, it's the paganism of Rome is something to behold in history. And if you look at it, you can see the great monuments and all the other stuff, and you realize just a lot of people died. And that seems to be the inexplicable path we're on, is that quest for power. And I don't know what to do other than to pray right now. I mean, I have my little schemes of, you know, the bullet soap that I think about, and think about ways to understand and frame the narrative. That's a key component. There was one big-time lefty, quite an interesting fellow actually, who suddenly realized that the Russia hoax was in fact a hoax. He thought it was the real thing. And he was a well-informed guy who's constantly on YouTube, you know, talking about his perspectives, and he's a very well-known guy, and all of a sudden he's come to the realization he was duped. And the question is, for him now, what do you do? Now that you realize you've been lied to, as I've said a few times before, I lived in Austin, Texas for a long time and had a great career down there. And I was pretty much a lib, you know, pretty much kind of bought into that, you know, Austin, the Moscow on the Colorado. And then one day I realized I kind of had an awakening like this gentleman did, that I've been lied to. It's just nothing but a pack of lies. These people are serial liars, and they will change their story in a heartbeat to get what they want. And what they want is your allegiance, your money, and any power you can give them. To give them power is frightful and very unwise. Amen.